The second paper of the panel will be given by Pauline Goul, who is a visiting assistant professor of French and Francophone Studies at Vassar College. This is another person who made me realize how eco-criticism was important and how we should go into this avenue. So she's currently working on a book entitled Renaissance Ecology of Waste. And she's also co-editing with Philip John Usher a volume entitled Early Modern Ecologies. Thank you very much, Pauline.
Thank you. There is something instantly pleasing about the title of Milan Kundera's novel in French, because it was published in French, L'insoutenable légèreté de l'être, which I'm obviously parodying in the title. And it dignifies the novel with the status of instant classic, for how could such a remarkable title belong to a mediocre novel? And the purpose of today's talk is, of course, not to discuss the quality of that novel itself. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about it much, but to talk about a certain kind of ecology. Outside of its direct but problematic definition, the concept of sustainability in French usually equals that of durability because of its translation into développement durable. But I would tend to prefer soutenable or insoutenable as productive and ambivalent concepts. In fact, I don't even know why it was not kept in the French, and I'm sort of looking through that, so if anyone knows or has a comment on it, I would be happy to take it. Lightness should not be unsustainable, for insoutenable presupposes a certain kind of weight. Ecology exists within a similar oxymoron. It is light because it's green and idealistic, at least in the way that it's commonly represented for most of the public who are not eco-criticism scholar. And it is unbearable because it is not enough. So I want to start with two quotes. I haven't put immediately who the authors of the quotes are, so if you want to volunteer it, if you recognize it. But I want to remain in that space where we don't know who they are for a little while. The first quote is « Et petit à petit, on s'accommode de la gravité et on se fait complice de la tragédie qui est en cours de gestation ». So I'll translate immediately like this. And little by little, we get accustomed to gravity and we become accomplice to the tragedy that is gestating. And then, je sais que l'esprit profond du peuple français, and that will probably clue you in, a toujours été de ne pas se soumettre à la tragédie écologique et faire des choix clairs et profonds pour changer notre manière de produire, de nous déplacer, de nous alimenter. Là aussi, il ne s'agit ni de dénoncer une tragédie, ni de rester dans l'immobilisme, mais de prendre des décisions profondes, inédites. So again, I'm translating. I know that the profound spirit of the French people has always been to not yield to the ecological tragedy, to make clear and profound choices to change the way that we produce, the way that we move around, and the way that we feed ourselves. And there too, it is not a matter of denouncing a tragedy, nor is it a matter of remaining still, or not moving, I guess, but to take profound and never seen before decisions. So anyone wants to volunteer who that is? The second one is Président Macron. The first one is Nicolas Hulot in his interview where he actually resigned on national radio without, it seems, realizing that he was going to do that at the beginning. So the juxtaposition of these two quotes tells us a few things, but I'm going to note two of them. One, that it's probably one is probably a response to the other, first of all, and also that it's possible to agree with both the president and his resigning minister at the same time. And second, that the vocabulary of theater and that of tragedy in particular has officially contaminated political discourse around the question of ecology. And somehow issues have crystallized recently because the skeptics are in power, at least in some areas of the world. They have left the Paris Climate Agreement, and because it is becoming undeniable that it's a bit too late for optimism. As Roy Scranton puts it, as he urges us to in his book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, and I'm quoting him, from the perspective of many policy experts, climate scientists, and national security officials, the concern is not whether global warming exists or how we might prevent it, but how we are going to adapt to life in the hot, volatile world that we have created, unquote. And in a more concise quote, and pardon his French here, it's not mine, we're fucked, the only questions are how soon and how badly, unquote. But the more insistent the proof to the public, the more stagnant the reaction seems to be. Ecological thoughts, from articles to films to some books, cannot bear for the tone to remain light much longer. And that's the question that David Wallace Wells rose in his now infamous New York Magazine article from the summer of 2017. Maybe a few of you in the room were the ones to share it on social media and make it buzz. The Uninhabitable Earth. The question that David Wallace Wells rose was perhaps the first example of this genre of unapologetic pessimism. And it's a philosophical and societal one. What are the consequences of renouncing optimism about climate change? And if you remember what happened around this article is that it was buzzing on the internet and social media for a few days. And it forced the New York Magazine to produce an annotated version with, I think they say, interviews with scientists and links to further reading to sort of prove their point. And the author in this annotated version wrote a little preface almost to what he meant, and in it he says, in that context, I don't think it's a slur to call an article or its writer alarmist. I'll accept that characterization. We should be alarmed. We should be alarmed, yeah. And in Nicolas Hulot's words, it is clear that even for a non-literary scholar, the question is more efficiently subsumed by the related concepts of tragedy and comedy. Given the facts, how do we orient ecology and how do we orient ourselves within the Anthropocene? It's how I choose to read the pronominal, the reflexive verb of Latour's subtitle to où atterrir. Hulot's moment is interesting because it represents the passage from one, which is the ethereal, suspected, incapable, and constant optimistic écolo, to the other, a pessimist who gets prophetic on national radio, claiming Je n'y crois plus, I don't believe it anymore, and j'espère que mon départ provoquera une profonde introspection de notre société sur la réalité du monde. I hope that my resignation will trigger a profound introspection of our society on the reality of the world. Macron's response is also exemplary. Let us not yield to pessimism, a weak and cowardly position, and let us change profoundly. Let us take unprecedented decisions indeed. In other words, blind capitalocene optimism. The poles or extremes are as follows. On the one hand, the public cannot resist a certain tuning of ecology as an optimistic, dynamic energy, exemplified by President Macron's PR stunt, Make Our Planet Great Again. It's obvious, on the other hand, that the simply pessimistic, tragic, or doomsday approaches to ecology are quite literally unbearable, as exemplified by the shocked reactions to Nicolas Hulot's resignation as Minister of Ecology, by the increasing number of articles such as Uninhabitable Earth, or by books such as Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. Fully processing the situation risks condemning most of us to inertia. Another kind of energy, I argue, is to be found in the endurance of a darker ecology, but a darker ecology that recognizes its own absurdity and looks at it with satirical eyes. An ecology that, all in all, sustains the ambivalence of its own endeavors much more than it currently does. In my book Manuscript, A Renaissance Ecology of Waste, I investigate the uses of waste as an environmental and philosophical concept as much as a literary one, in the works of Rabelais, Montaigne, and travel narratives in the New World written by French explorers. What I found, and it has something to do with waste, but I'm not going to talk about it today. What I found were what I call moments of disorientation that are directly or indirectly provoked by the discovery of the new continent and its consequences and meanings. Indeed, even when you would think that the text has little to do with America, there comes a moment that blatantly illustrates how decentered, how unsettled human beings were around the 16th century, in France at least. With the word disorientation, in a talk given at Cornell University in the fall of 2016, Brunetto Latini evokes the present dislocation of our politics today. But he also talks of that disorientation as having occurred first after Columbus, and I'm quoting him here. This time, it is not a novel continent in addition to the land we used to inhabit, as was the case at the time of the European land grab, but the same land whose behavior has become unrecognizable, unquote. I'll proceed to give a few examples of such moments, moments where disorientation intersects with what I see as a queer ecology, moments in which movement is crucial. Let us ponder together what these juxtaposed moments have in common. First moment. At the very beginning of the first book of Rabelais' Chronicles, Pantagruel, the whole planet is in a severe state of environmental crisis. There was a drought in Africa, and it made the whole planet arid. Rabelais describes the terrible state of trees and of various animals, and then reflects on the possible causes of the drought. So Peggy's paper is nicely related here. It is in this context that Pantagruel is born. As an afterthought, we are told that his mother dies in childbirth, because she gives birth to not only this gigantic baby, but before him a whole parade of men holding mules loaded with salted meats and vegetables. Badebec, Pantagruel's mother, dies while giving birth to him, for in the words of Rabelais, he suffocated her. This is not brought up again in the whole chapter, and it is only later in the next chapter that Gargantua, her husband and Pantagruel's father, reacts. So chapter 3 is devoted to Gargantua's struggle in deciding rationally whether to cry for the death of his wife or be joyful at the birth of his son. He is both ébahi et perplexe, and I'm quoting here the French, but the English is on the PowerPoint, et le doute que troublait son entendement était, à savoir s'il devait pleurer pour le deuil de sa femme ou rire pour la joie de son fils. D'un côté et d'autre, il y avait arguments sophistiques qui le suffoquaient, just like his wife suffocated to death, car il les faisait très bien in modo et figura, mais il ne les pouvait soudre. So Gargantua hesitates between tragedy and comedy, which are both present in potentiality within the text. He then decides to skip the funeral, reasoning that le temps est dangereux, and here time is very much either time or weather. And that, I'm quoting here, elle ne se soucie plus de nos misères et calamités. This moment of indecision between laughing or crying is a disorientation that is indirectly provoked by an environmental event. Our own position within the ecological crisis is a similar one, stuck between a tragedy we seem unable to avoid and the absurd comical sense that comes with some pieces of news. For instance, the climaxing irony of the Anthropocene, which is that we did it to ourselves, or most recently, the announcement that the new Secretary of State for Ecology in France is a former lobbyist for the biggest French food products corporation, Danone. Second moment. The first known occurrence of the noun environment in French is found within the same pages as the first occurrence of something like sustainability. In a chapter of Brunetto Latini's Les Livres du Trésor, known as the first encyclopedia in a somewhat modern European language. The text is swarming with disorientation and non-human bodies. In Comment les mondes est rond et comment les éléments sont établis, Latini starts with En ce fut nature bien port-véant, quand elle fit l'orbem tout rond. Nature was filled with foresight when it made the world round. Port-véant, from the French verb pourvoir, from the Latin providere, voir en avant, to foresee, prévoir, to predict, pourvoir à, to equip or to provide for, être prévoyant, to cater for, or even in the modern definition of the trésor de la langue française, mettre quelqu'un en possession de ce qui lui est nécessaire et utile, to put someone in possession of what is necessary and useful to them. It seems to be an environmental verb that could and should complement the modern concept of sustainability. The reason the orb is round then has to do with something that recalls the earlier pourvoir. And I'm quoting here. D'autre part, convient-il à fine force que l'orbis soit tout plein dedans soi, si que l'une chose sostienne l'autre, car sans sostennement ne pourrait-il m'y être. Latini's environment refuses emptiness, but it also couples the notions of providing with that of sustaining. His is a seemingly mutual reciprocal relationship before the anthropocentrism brought about by humanism. Within this context, it is an egg, a consideration of a white and yolk and of the relationship between the two in its surprising complementarity that triggers the word environnement for the first recorded time, or the first known time, I guess. Et ce est la raison pourquoi la Terre, qui est le plus gris élément et de plus sous de substance, est assise au milieu de tout cercle et de tout environnement, se hait au fond des ciels et des éléments. Environnement is almost stripped from meaning, having frequently appeared previously as a verb and by now a noun. In context, it could simply repeat and mean the same as cercle, or it could point at precisely something different, something more, and yet undefined. While in this case it is coupled with cercle through the conjunction et, a few lines above, as a verb, it was coupled with enclose, enclose et environné. Its main characteristics are the circle and its enclosure. Ultimately, Brunetto Latini describes his object, the orbis, as constantly moving. Et il convient que le ciel et le firmament se tournent et se remuent toujours. This is perhaps the best enactment of the etymology of environment, far from establishing a static milieu that is acted upon by human beings, demonstrating that movement is key. As Karen Pincus shows in her article, The Risk of Sustainability, the etymology of environment is the Latin vibrare, giving us also vire, to veer, in the navigating sense of the word. The environment vibrates, agitates, but also significantly it turns. Third moment. Centuries later, Montaigne uses the verb environner in the very potent passage in the middle of Descoches, which focuses on the devastation of the New World by Europeans. There, Montaigne uses the pretext of coaches, modes of transportation, for a discussion of extravagance and luxury, and ultimately expenditure, which leads to the last line, narrating the death of the Inca emperor Atahualpa at the hands of the Spaniards. In the essay, he contrasts what he calls the appalling magnificence of the cities of Cusco and Mexico with the monstrous devastation that the conquest has brought upon them, and on a side note, how similar are the movements and emotions of épouvantable magnificence and those of insoutenable légèreté. It is in this context of violence and ruin that Montaigne brings up as another épouvantable magnificence, the Roman circus, to be read surely as a metaphor of the conquest. So the quote I'm going to read in French is just before that Latin quote right here. C'était aussi belle chose. So, c'était aussi belle chose à voir, ces grands amphithéâtres encroutés de marbre en dehors, tous les côtés de ce grand vide, remplis et environnés depuis le fond jusqu'aux combles, de 60 et 80 rangs d'échelons, aussi de marbre couverts de carreaux. There is no center to speak of, the pointlessness of it being suggested by the fact that what is surrounded here, emphasis on the passive voice, is not a thing, but instead ce grand vide, this great emptiness. The whole chapter is also characterized by a lot of other pointless movements. The underlying movement of transportation, symbolizing all the coaches and vessels and horses that linked the early modern worlds. In fact, the chapter starts with an evocation of seasickness, the soulèvement d'estomac qui advient à ceux qui voyagent en mer, the heaving of the stomach that afflicts those who travel by sea. Towards the middle of the chapter, Montaigne expresses a sense of disorientation. And so here, what I'm going to read is unreadable in the picture of the Exemplaire de Bordeaux because it's actually handwritten. It was changed by him on a second writing spree. So it's turning human beings into something more akin to the atoms of Lucretius, with verbs that recall the non-human objects in Latini. Nous n'allons point, nous rôdons plutôt, et tournoyons ça et là, nous nous promenons sur nos pas. There is another movement here, one that has no aim, no direction, other than to just persist, and it's also a special queer movement. Rôder, the verb, is etymologically a circular verb. It is the very idea of going in circles. Essentially, Montaigne declares that we do not go in a straight line, but in a circle, and we go on and on again. It is a movement without a purpose, non-productive, and thus queer, for it is a kind of aberrant temporality. Fourth moment. In the prologue to Rabelais' Tiers Livre, we find his rewriting of the episode of the preparations for war in the city of Corinth that features Diogenes the Cynic. Without exception, the inhabitants of Corinth are busy with purposeful activities. Diogenes looks on and proceeds to take the only thing he owns, his barrel, that he slips in, and he rolls it up and down the slope, thoroughly agitating it. So you have here 3 pages from the French. so you can look through, and I'll read the English. So both Diogenes' activity and those of the rest of the citizens, so those of the rest of the citizens are up here on the left page, and then Diogenes starts here in the second paragraph and continues all the way through. So both of these activities are narrated similarly, with an excessive style full of redundancy and repetitions in the form of lists. However, where the Corinthians do a variety of things, many different verbs, which are on a page that I didn't choose, but all the way up here, to a variety of things, many different objects, which you can see on the enumeration of weapons here. Diogenes' list is only a list of verbs, all conjugated in the same person and tense, whose common meaning is that of pure movement. I should note also that the movements here are also circular. The action takes place on une belle esplanade, the flat top of a hill, but Diogenes rolls his barrel and agitates it in several circular movements, tourner, virer, where we find veering again. The whole thing degenerates into pure movement. The first movement has a shape, a direction, but it soon becomes just movement for the sake of it. In fact, it is even difficult to visually represent what Diogenes actually does. He seems to be moving it, shaking it, caressing it, and sometimes rolling it down the hill back up again. I'll read the end of the episode in English, and it starts here in the third page. Se voyant, quelques-uns de ses amis. Seeing this, one of his friends asked him what cause impelled him thus to torment his body, his spirit, and his barrel. To which the philosopher replied that being employed on no other business by the Commonwealth, he harried his barrel this way amid this people so fervent and occupied, not alone to seem a slacker and an idler. Unquote. For Diogenes, it would be unbearable to remain idle, but equally unbearable to join the true preparations for war. His movement is absolutely pointless, but it is in his own way productively queer because he does not do nothing. Only 2 of these 4 moments are definitely satirical, I think, while the others, not hiding behind the curtain of fiction, are perhaps a bit more serious. Almost all of them present, nonetheless, circular movements that are in many ways pointless. The circus, the barrel, the orb, arguably Gargantua's laughter as well. They almost all involve a persistent, enduring movement whose source of energy is difficult to identify. However, all this energy is pointless, that is to say, non-productive. Almost all of these movements constitute interruptions, taking stock of a given situation and restarting the movement. For Montaigne and Rabelais in particular, the moments are deeply ambivalent, in that they could go to the optimistic comical pole or to the pessimistic tragic pole instantaneously, and it seems also arbitrarily. We are supposed to be surprised that Gargantua does not take more time to mourn his wife, or does not express his happiness at the birth of his son with a more serious tone, at least. The gravity of his tragedy is so unbearable that he chooses comedy. We are supposed to be surprised and a bit disoriented that Montaigne starts a chapter on coaches by talking about sneezing, but ends it on the cruel tragic death of the last Inca emperor. Both of their tones could sometimes be qualified as light, whether it's the satire of Rabelais or the facetious tone of Montaigne. But their lightness is not unsustainable because it has gone through the process of pondering that ambivalence. Perhaps light or heavy, optimistic or pessimistic, is not the correct way to look at ecology, for its characteristic is mostly an ambivalent pointlessness. The very disorientation that is key to our sense or to our conception of ecology is that it could be both an optimistic, productive endeavor or a pessimistic, futile one, whose only value would be its ethics and morality. These 4 moments tell the stories of random, non-productive movements of wonder and or of laughter. In the face of headlines such as just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions, study says, or billionaires are the leading cause of climate change, the individual human being might feel such a disorientation. Taking stock of this, and of the unlikelihood that anything will change soon enough, I would argue then that there is a kind of failure inherent to the very endeavor of ecology, be it individual, political, or neoliberal. Yet within those failures, an alternative ecology is found. with Jack Halberstam, who finds in The Queer Art of Failure, and I'm quoting him here, an alternative to cynical resignation on the one hand and naive optimism on the other, unquote. Admitting failure as a productive concept allows for a reassessing and a repositioning of the ecological thought and ecological endeavors. As Vincent Bruyère masterfully puts it in his recent book, Perishability Fatigue, we live, after all, in a world where we build seed banks, where, I'm quoting him, doing something about the future consists in investing in burial grounds, storage facilities, and other repositories, unquote. In a world where, in many ways, it has already failed, why would the idea of failure in ecological thought be so unbearable? A few propositions to finish here. Number one, that instead of learning how to die in the Anthropocene with Roy Scruton, one could learn how to live ironically or cynically, which is perhaps even closer to what Montaigne originally meant in Que de philosopher, c'est apprendre à mourir. To philosophize is to learn how to die. That we take seriously what some have said under the disguise of jest or satire, as Vincent Bruyère urges us to in his first chapter, entitled Being Fabulous as the Climate Changes. Number two, along those lines, that we recognize the productivity of fables, of fictions, whether they're science or not, that claim their own fictionality instead of claiming a sense of truth, in reflecting on where we go from now. And number three, that we strive to formulate a queer ecology, one that does not depend on a sense of efficacy to endure, to persist, one whose movements, recycling, protesting, gleaning, satirizing, caricaturing from the outskirts of town, swarming, have long existed outside of the logic of productivity and have also long failed to effect a real decrease in the ever-growing consumption of goods and of carbon. Its value then is to produce alternatives, to persist and to satirize. An early modern and French and queer ecology is unbearably and fundamentally a salvaging movement and a waste of time. Thank you.